Self-determination is a pillar of the modern international system, yet it's one of the most misunderstood and misapplied concepts in international relations. While many view it as a straightforward right for peoples to govern themselves, usually within independent sovereign states, the reality is far more complex. Far from being a single idea, over the past 80 years it's evolved into two separate and distinct principles, a confusion that's fed countless conflicts worldwide. So, what exactly do we mean when we talk about self-determination? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security and statehood. Few ideas are so utterly central to our understanding of the modern world as self-determination. Countless ethnic, linguistic and even religious groups seeking to win their freedom cite a right to self-determination to justify their claim for a separate, independent, sovereign state. This has led to many insurgencies and conflicts as groups fight to break away from an existing country. More recently, the concept has even been used to justify Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with many arguing that the country's Russian-speaking community has a right to self-determination. And yet, there are few ideas in modern international relations that are so often misunderstood as the concept of self-determination. While it's correct to claim that various peoples do have a right to self-determination, the term doesn't usually automatically mean that the people in question have a right to break away from an existing country, let alone form a separate state. In truth, except in certain specific circumstances, it means anything but independence. To understand why the term is so misunderstood and misused, we need to explore how the concept originally emerged. The first stirrings of the idea came in the 17th century, following the Treaty of Westphalia, which saw the emergence of states as we now know them. Philosophers such as John Locke argued that legitimate government must be based on the consent of those governed. This was further advanced in the 18th century when Jean-Jacques Rousseau called for people to have the right to determine their political system free from external interference. And it was these ideas that not only shaped the revolution in France, but also led to the uprising against British rule in North America. By the 19th century, the idea of self-determination was shaping independence movements across Europe as various nations began calling for their own states. This not only led to independence from Ottoman imperial rule in Southeast Europe, it later shaped German and Italian unification. Although self-determination was a powerful force in the 19th century, it really came to the fore of modern international relations following the end of the First World War. In his famous 14 points, US President Woodrow Wilson called for different nations to have their own countries or be permitted to exercise self-rule. Speaking to Congress in February 1918, he echoed the words of earlier thinkers, stating that just as national aspirations should be respected, people could only be governed by consent. As he put it, self-determination is not a mere phrase, it's an imperative principle of action which statesmen will henceforth ignore at their peril. But while this was certainly an admirable idea, it presented very real practical problems. First of all, there was the question of which groups should be allowed to form states. Was there a minimum number of people required? Secondly, there was also the question of how to define the borders of these countries. Giving a nation a state could work where they lived in specific areas without other groups. However, the real world is very different. Territories often contain many different peoples. How would states and their borders be formed in these cases? Which group would get a piece of particular land? For all these reasons, while Wilsonian self-determination was a powerful idea and formed the basis of the modern concept of self-determination, it was never as easy to put into practice as it may have seemed. Indeed, even today, these questions pose serious problems when we think about independence movements. I hope you're finding this useful. If so, please consider giving it a like and perhaps subscribing to the channel if you don't already. It all really helps. Thanks so much And now, back to the video. While self-determination may have a long history, our current understanding of the term only emerged after the Second World War, when the principle was written into the United Nations Charter. The trouble was that the Charter also enshrined the principle of territorial integrity of states. This presented a fundamental contradiction. How could nations gain their independence if state borders were sacrosanct? The answer came over the following decade and a half. As discussions evolved over decolonisation, the idea of self-determination was further refined. Instead of being seen as a blanket right equally applied to all peoples, two separate notions emerged. First, there was the concept of what we now call external self-determination. Applied to peoples living under alien subjugation, this form of self-determination granted a right to independent statehood. Crucially, though, the term alien subjugation was explicitly understood to mean overseas colonial rule or military occupation. It didn't apply to groups within existing recognised states, even if they felt they were under foreign occupation. Moreover, even in colonial context, it was understood as a one-off right. When a new state emerged from decolonisation, the groups within its borders lost their right to break away. Instead, they became subject to the second form of self-determination. Known as internal self-determination, this applied to groups within existing sovereign states. In such cases, the concept didn't mean a right to independence. Instead, it was accepted that the people should have a say over their economic, social and cultural development. In real terms, it meant self-rule within the country. This could take many different forms, from language rights through to extensive self-government, even up to and including federal arrangements. But again, it didn't mean a right to create a separate, independent sovereign state. So, what does all this mean in current terms? Essentially, as the decolonisation process is now almost over and few territories are under military occupation, the idea of external self-determination now applies only to a very few groups. Apart from non-self-governing territories, the UN's list of remaining colonial holdings, the most obvious example is the Palestinian people. However, in every other case, self-determination signifies a right to a degree of self-rule within the borders of an existing state, whatever that may entail in real terms. Of course, all this is unfairly weighted against groups that do in fact want independence. But that is exactly the point. The community of existing states have created rules that protect their interests. But it doesn't mean that a state can't grant independence to a group within its borders if it so wants, though few obviously ever do. But it does mean that there's no recognised right for any group living within an established internationally recognised country to break away without the permission from that state, either to join another country or to form their own. I hope you found that helpful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.